The Sociology of Freedom. Manifesto of the Democratic Civilization. Volume 3. Written by Abdullah Öcalan. Chapter 6. The Emergence of the Social Problem. Problematic moments in the dialectic of various natures are defined as the periods of a qualitative leap in quantitative accumulation. While theories of order and progress describe moments of transformation as very short intervals, chaos theory emphasized the centrality of the chaotic situation, with order and progress remaining limited moments. Thoughts about the continuity of the chaotic environment and ideas that advocate the continuity of progress have kept human reason busy. While there are those who think that human reason, like a mirror, should reflect reality, there are others who believe that the origin of all reason is to be found in humans. It is not difficult to identify the universalist and relativist interpretations in these thoughts. To approach these issues more concretely, it is necessary to define and deal with the question of social reason. Therefore, my analysis up to this point, the groundwork for providing a deeper understanding, is an introduction to the source of the social problem. Throughout history, all important intellectual breakthroughs have emerged during one of two periods. When things are going well within the system, social prosperity is satisfactory, and there are no major problems, the result is intellectual development. The thought, which is progressive in nature, brings prosperity, does not give rise to significant problems, and tries to instill confidence in people, speaks of its permanence. It considers problems to be incidental and temporary. It mostly focuses on first nature, and does not want to deal with social nature. The thought during other periods, when the system is overwhelmed, cannot carry on as it is, and is consumed with problems, is generally preoccupied with second nature. It is during these periods that new religious and philosophical pursuits proliferate. The solution to problems is sought in new ideas, new religions, and new philosophical insights. The intellectual flow during both prosperous and problematic periods, with their great intellectual leaps, can be observed in all civilizations. In the highly prosperous period of Sumerian society, we witness a magnificent leap of mythological thought, which has influenced all major religions, philosophies, sciences, and schools of art. There are no major religions, philosophies, sciences, or schools of art that were not influenced by the emergence of Sumerian thought. Similarly, the intellectual leap attained in ancient Greece was also linked to a period of prosperity. The fertile land in Mesopotamia was at the heart of Sumerian prosperity, while in Greece it was the result of the fertile land on both shores of the Aegean. While the Sumerians developed a magnificent mythology, in Ionia, philosophical thought came to the fore. There were developments of a revolutionary magnitude in both science and the arts. A similar surge of prosperity in Europe led to a great intellectual leap that by the 16th century had a worldwide impact. It is noteworthy that the intellectual revolutions seen during all three periods of prosperity started with discussions of first nature. However, when prosperity slows and crises erupt, discussions about second nature begin to predominate, and new ideas fuel fresh exploration. Some thoughts long for the past, charged with the memory of previous prosperity and order, while the avant-garde complain about the disorder and the gravity of the crisis and produce utopian ideas. They talk abundantly of new social forms. The outcome of all this searching is the formation of numerous societies. Various social formations come into being, including religious and denominational communities, new emergent tribal clans, and even nations, as in the European example. Approaching history as the history of thought brings us face to face with social problems, making it impossible not to actually sense the enormous dimensions of these problems in present-day society. I am trying not to think in terms of Eurocentric social sciences. I am conscious of the need to think independently of the Western social sciences. Some may underestimate this approach and judge it to be a deviation from the social sciences, but that is of no consequence. The Eurocentric social sciences truly stink of domination. You either dominate or are dominated. What we need, however, is to be democratic subjects and share things justly. European social science is, in essence, liberalism, which is to say, it is an ideology. But it has hidden this reality so well that it has even had the power to assimilate the thinking of its greatest opponents, using its own outstanding eclecticism. I have no other option but to develop a distinct analytical approach if I don't want to fall victim to this eclecticism. My position, however, is not one of anti-Europeanism. Anti-Europeanism is also part of Eurocentric thought. I develop my position by discerning which of our values are universal, because Europe can be found in the East, and the East in Europe. Many European values reflect the present and further developed state of our own values. More often than not, those who are most anti-European become the most backward proponents of European liberalism. The practice of real socialism and national liberation movements abound with examples. Marx and Engels developed the concept of scientific socialism as a solution to the social problem of their time, and they truly believed in it. They believed that they had defined the problem correctly by conceptualizing capitalism as a system. So when it came to building the socialist system, they were certain they would find a way. So much so that they believed the scientific socialism that they had developed guaranteed it. But history developed otherwise. Previous utopians had similar expectations, and Lenin hoped for different results from the Russian Revolution. Many French revolutionaries were also terribly disappointed. The revolution devoured many of its own children. The depths of history overflow with similar examples. There is no question that those who wanted to solve the problem were fully committed and conscious of what they were doing. However, there is obviously something wrong and incomplete with their experience of defining and analyzing the social problem, given the huge deviations and contrary developments in practice. As has been frequently emphasized, the issue is not the lack of effort or a rebellion and war. These exist in abundance. For all of these reasons, I feel the definition and solution of the social problem must be approached with caution. If we know how to learn from experience and respect the memory of the great heroines and heroes, each step we take will certainly be rife with the lessons learned from them and charged with a deep respect. Defining the problem of historical society. In the first 2 volumes of my defense, I focused on power in general and on the capitalist monopoly of power in particular. Although these books have many shortcomings, I believe I effectively demonstrated that the central civilization system constitutes a line. The important thing was to present the key links in its development. I identified the issues and analyzed the accumulations of power, including the cumulative accumulation of capital in its successive development. When I was writing these 2 volumes, I had not yet read Andre Gunder Frank's The World System. What I did, in fact, was a different recounting of the contents of this anthology, in which I was inclined to link the solution to a system, that is, democratic civilization. Were I to write these books now, I could perhaps refine my argument, but out of respect for history, it is more valuable to leave them as they are. I will be addressing the social problem in a separate section. My aim is not to present a history of power and monopoly, or to discuss the democratic solution. I am attempting to theoretically address the social problem in light of practical experience, as a contribution to solving the problem. It is not that I have not touched on this question until now. I have treated it in bits and pieces, but it would be more instructive to address it in an overall way. The question of how to define the social problem is thought-provoking. Some currents of thought consider social poverty, while others think that not having a state is the social problem. Yet others think that military weakness is the key issue, or that it is the errors of political system, the economy, or moral degeneration that are central. Perhaps there is no single social arena that is not considered problematic. There may well be something in each of these points of views, but they don't reflect the essence of the problem. To me, it makes more sense to present the trampling of the fundamental dynamics of society as the social problem. I think society deprived of being a society is the fundamental problem. The first issue is the existence of values that determine a society and conceive and construct a social existence. I'm referring to the aspect that we call existence itself. Second, I'm referring to developments that do not allow this existence to be itself and destroy its basis. When these two things are intertwined, there is a major social problem. For example, if glaciation during the clan period eliminated all the clans, we cannot call this a social problem, because natural disasters occur beyond human will. To be considered a social problem, the problem must be created by the human hand. Even the ecological problem should be defined as a social problem when it is the result of human activity. Therefore, linking the fundamental social problem to the forces that unravel and destroy society at its very foundations will lead us to a correct definition. I see the monopoly of capital and the monopoly of power to be at the forefront of these forces. Both are essentially forces that hollow out the foundations of society by usurping surplus value. From this point on, I will refer to these two monopolies simply as the monopoly. Defining the problem-free, normal and natural state of society will also shed more light on the issue and contribute to our ongoing evaluation. Regardless of the level and form of a community, if a society can freely shape its own moral structure and politics, then we can call it a normal or natural society. It is also possible to call it an open or democratic society. Because I will focus on my proposed solution in later sections, let me just briefly emphasize that I will not present the solution as either a fully liberal or fully socialist society. The nation-state society, the affluent society, or as a consumption-based, industrial, or service-oriented society, because any classification of society of this sort is largely speculative. These definitional categories don't have an equivalent in a real society. Calling them attributes related to society would be more accurate. Therefore, depriving a society based on free politics and morality of these fundamental qualities can be regarded the beginning of the problem. Monopoly is the force that triggers the problem. Thus, we must also define the scope of the monopoly. A monopoly is formed when surplus value, whether accumulated privately or by the state, is amassed agriculturally, commercially, and industrially. Undoubtedly, the initial triad within the monopoly, priest, strongman, and sheik, was hierarchical. They each benefited from the monopoly proportional to their power. This triadic monopoly would eventually splinter off into various institutions over the course of history. Each of these institutions would also split internally, but would essentially be carried to the present by increasing their chain-like influence. We should always keep in mind the cumulative and chain-like character of the historical flow of monopoly. The central civilization system is both the cause and the effect of the chain-like development of the monopoly. This must be emphasized. Today, modernity's way of thinking imposes a terrible time pressure and stifles everything into a compressed now. But now is both history and the future. Modernity's massacre of history by imposing this way of thinking is not in vain. It is much easier to rule a society that is cut off from tradition, however the ruler wishes. The history of monopoly is unique in that no other history had the opportunity of such an intense, chain-like, and expanding self-formation. While the monopoly creates its history in this way, it also finds it essential to render all communities in all societies historyless, or put otherwise, their dissolution and colonization is of the utmost importance. To this end, it forms mythological, religious, philosophical, and scientific structures and makes an effort to undermine the morality of communities and render them incapable of politics. While we often use monopoly as a concept, let's not forget that we use it in economic, military, political, ideological, and commercial contexts, because these groups share surplus value in one way or another. Whatever the form and the ratio, the essence of the division remains unchanged. Based on their importance at a given point, sometimes those responsible for economic efficiency will have a say in how surplus value is shared, while at other times it will be the military, the political class, the ideologues, or the merchant cliques. Wholesale concepts like class and state can blur reality. Monopoly plays a clearer role. It is the exploitative and oppressive enterprise. The class and state formation behind it are of derivative value. They are secondary births. The construction of the city is the third of the monopoly births. The city raises its head as monopoly's oppression and exploitation headquarters. The city is intertwined with the temple to provide it with ideological legitimacy. And so the city, as historically eventuated, first and foremost, appeared as the nucleus of the temple, military headquarters, and living structures like palaces of the bourgeois. We can call all these exploitative urban circles bourgeois. The surrounding masses play a role of domestic servants, as the second ring around the core of castles. They could even be called the slave class. The fortresses and ramparts that are continuously encountered in history are the clearest evidence of the nature of monopoly's urban structure. The factors that give rise to the social problem are the city, class, and state structures that came into existence around monopoly's essence. In a sense, the history of civilizations is the expansion of this triad across time and space. The logic is simple. As opportunities for surplus value increase, so do monopolies, leading to the construction of new city, class, and state structures. Simultaneously, these basic structures create very strict traditions. The city tales, state traditions, and dynastic histories are a never-ending topic of narration. Those who are clever and have oratorical talent provide the necessary daily ideological legitimacy as the army of Alima. There is almost no room for new fairy tales or parables, from the construction of gods, city gods and war gods, to the creation of the devil and jinn, from portraits of heaven and hell to literary epics. There is no area where they have not invented something. The fear-inducing structures, like the mausoleums, palaces, and temples, as well as the theaters and stadiums, constructed by surplus human labor, are like monopoly's show of power. Part of the monopolistic tradition is to eradicate whole peoples, tribes, cities or villages, with their entire population, excluding any captives who might prove useful, in horrifying wars. Besides, anything of economic value can already be found in monopoly's holy book as the plunder of holy war. The type of civilization developed by the monopoly after the agricultural revolution, thus the derivative triad, city, class, and state, is relevant to our examination of the emergence of the social problem. The questions are, was the transition from the Neolithic stage of society to civilization, that is, the stages of development also called slave-owning, feudal, and capitalist society, unavoidable? Were there ways that Neolithic society could have made the leap to a higher stage without urbanization based on class and the state? If so, why didn't that happen? Although such questions address the hypothetical, they nonetheless touch upon important matters, which will be discussed in greater depth in the section dealing with the democratic civilization system. At this juncture, I will nonetheless briefly answer those questions as part of our examination of social nature. According to the prevailing paradigms of civilization, all developments were destiny, and everything happened as it was meant to, according to destiny. Our fate has been realized. All metaphysical constructs are based on this idea. The analysis of democratic civilization, however, makes for a different interpretation of civilization and its social forms, and has a different approach to the continuation and transformation of Neolithic society. In short, social reality is not what Eurocentric social sciences claim it is. Interpretations that come closer to the truth are certainly possible. Society comes into being differently than we have been led to believe. Seeing the difference between the standard discourses and reality, as well as recognizing the link between these discourses and the dominant central civilization system, is of great importance. Many categorical evaluations that have been imposed as indisputable truth and presented on behalf of the social sciences are predominantly propaganda. They aim at concealing the truth. Many schools of social science, including those advanced by scientific socialism, have been heavily influenced by liberalism. These issues need to be clarified, at least to some degree, or the margin of error in any response will be relatively large. Identifying social problems at their origin in this way will lead to a more realistic interpretation of their development. Instead of dividing them into basic categories, presenting them as key stages in a process is more instructive, because this addresses the problem in its totality. The first major problematic stage of the monopoly of civilization. The first major problematic stage of the monopoly of civilization can be placed between 3000 BC and 500 CE. Monopoly is a large organization that extorts surplus value from society in different ways, depending on time and place. Beginning in 3000 BC, the Sumerian, Egyptian, and Harappa societies attained extraordinary agricultural surplus product using a method of organization that could be called pharaoh socialism. This is capital's first major model for accumulation. A much higher level of productivity was attained than had been in the case in Neolithic society. This productivity gave rise to the city, class, and the state. The first major age of exploitation, based on either violence or a trade monopoly, began with the advent of the accumulation of surplus product that had already begun in the Neolithic society. There can be no doubt that pharaoh socialism was based on the exploitation of subjects who were worked like a new type of animal in exchange for food. This was the first link in the chain of exploitation that has culminated in today's exploitation of the periphery by the center. Available documentation clearly shows all of these developments in Sumerian society. Obviously, this mode of production and the seizure of surplus product led to severe problems, like a knife stabbed into the heart of society. Mythologies and religions abound with stories of such problems encountered in history. Among the available narratives are the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Genesis flood narrative, the legends of Adam and Eve, and of Cain and Abel, the construct of heaven and hell, the clash between the god Enki and the goddess Inanna, and the conflict between shepherds and farmers. It is quite clear that these narratives are essentially meant to expose the ruthless stabs of the monopoly, that is, the extortion of surplus product by seizing and working people like animals. Of course, a complex language is used in the countless stories that deal with similar examples of horrific plunder and forced human labor. It is important to keep in mind that during this period, ideological domination was as effective as physical domination. If history was written in the language of the oppressed and plundered, we would inevitably encounter a very different past than the one presented to us. Many millions of slaves worked to build the Egyptian pharaohs' pyramids. These were the pharaohs' mausoleums. What must their palaces have been like? These people were housed in congested, stable-like structures and were not even fed as well as the animals. They were whipped, often to death, while they worked to build these terrible structures. While these animal slaves, treated as property, were being used and abused in this way, the monopoly's military wing mounted expeditions against other communities. They were not just satisfied with the seizing of goods and the land used by these communities, but would take captive those seen as useful by the community and kill the rest. The magnificent castles, ramparts, mausoleums, arenas, palaces, and temples, which even today astonish the passers-by, were built by these captives. If these millions of captives had not been forced to work in agriculture, which was further developed by the first irrigation canals, such a huge surplus product could not have been produced, just as these gigantic stone structures would never have been built. And by extension, the heavenly life of the monopoly would not have been guaranteed. To present this horrendous period differently, narratives, mythology, religion, philosophy, and various schools of the arts and science, with roots in the Central Civilization, stretching from the Sumerian hegemonic civilization of Mesopotamia to present-day U.S. hegemonic civilization, and ideologies have been developed, alongside many equally grandiose superstructural institutions. Analytical in reason, in particular, made the most progress. The priests, under the leadership of the monopoly, developed numerous responses, including mythological utopias and portraits of heaven and hell. If that was not sufficient, philosophical and scientific explanations, as well as knowledge and wisdom that would better explain the phenomena of nature, were developed. To rule with greater ease, the initial steps in developing writing, mathematics, astronomy, and biology were taken. The search for new medication to ensure the monopolistic strata's comfort resulted in the foundation of medical science. The most exciting part of the Epic of Gilgamesh is the search for the immortality plant. Stone architecture developed techniques to build immortal structures for the immortals. When mythology proved inadequate, the era of more rigid and dogmatic religions was introduced. To console the people who were condemned to a terrible life, images of gods that reflected the god kings were created. Analytical reason probably presented its greatest masterpiece in the transition to monotheistic religions. Not only did this result in the social problem, the problem was delivered in its most terrible form. The monopoly descended like a nightmare onto society's material and immaterial culture. Even at that early time, the Sumerian word amargi meant return to the sacred mother and nature. degraded humanity could only crave for its past. To die as soon as possible, in order to go to heaven, reached the level of an ideology. The heavenly life that at times was imagined to have marked the Neolithic age was being deferred to other worlds and had become the subject of utopias. Secular, worldly consciousness was replaced by a consciousness that focused solely on the afterlife. Faced with this terrible problem, the world lost its diversal richness and was seen as a place of torment. Social morality and politics received their very first fatal blows at the hands of this monopoly problem. While the building blocks of communal society, morality and politics, were being smashed, a dominant morality, in fact an immorality, and politics, the divine state, specific to the narrow communities of the members of the monopoly, held sway. It is perfectly clear that the social morality and politics atrophied before they had a chance to develop. They were replaced by a divine order that consisted of the insane way of life of the rulers and their ideas of divinity. Society was only guaranteed this right, the right to embrace these narratives as the holy belief. The result was not just the creation of the social problem, but worse. Society was made to cease to be itself. It was being transformed into monopoly's animal farm. Slavery and servitude came to be accepted as the natural regime. The enslavement of women, which has become the most far-reaching life problem, has roots dating back to this primitive hierarchical period. Regimes with dominant male gods were built as if to take revenge on the Neolithic sacred mother society and matriarchal society. As traces of the goddesses gradually disappeared, the magnificent age of the domination of the male-imaged gods began. Even at that time, women found themselves forced into prostitution, both in the temple and in ordinary brothels, and were thus confined to public homes and private homes. This fertile period, partially the result of the newly developed irrigation technologies, fell into severe crisis in the late 2000s BCE. Both drought and soil salination played a role. It is only natural, however, that after a 2,000-year hiatus, the effects of social practice would disintegrate their own founding principles. Harappa had already disintegrated and fallen silent, and internal contradictions were making Egyptian civilization increasingly unsustainable. The Sumerians, once the dominant ethnic group, had long since been replaced by other civilizations with different ethnic origins. The central civilization system of this period made two significant attempts to solve the severe problems it caused. The first of these was outward expansion. The process of colonization and imperialism, something that will be frequently encountered later, offered a temporary solution to existing problems, but it could not avoid resulting in new problems. Problems were not solved. On the contrary, they became more prevalent and intensified. When the problems concentrated at the center, in the metropole, were extorted, they multiplied and rebounded upon the center after a brief respite. This cycle appears often throughout history, with center and periphery constantly shifting. In my view, the Sumerian metropole center exported itself in three cardinal directions, four if we include the sea. The product of its initial western expansion was the Egyptian Nile. It seems likely that Egypt first developed as a colony and continued to develop after independence. In the absence of external support, the development of a civilization in Egypt, in a geographically enclosed area, was an unlikely proposition. The fruit of the eastern Sumerian expansion was Harappa, on the shores of Sind. As with Egypt, without external support, Harappa could only have been a miracle in the desert. It is reasonable to similarly explain the birth of the first kingdom in China, around 1500 BCE. The center-periphery relationship is an essential feature of civilizational practice since the birth of civilization. Another important area of expansion to the east was the Elam civilization, today's Iran. With Susa as its capital, it was often referred to as Susiana, which neighbored Sumeria. The northward expansions, on the other hand, were carried by the Aryan Hurrians, the local communities of Upper Mesopotamia that had been the fundamental force behind the Neolithic Revolution, and Babel and Assyria, which were not far from the center. The Sumerians, Akkadians, an ethnic group with Semitic roots, the Babylonians and Assyrians, continuously tried to colonize the Hurrians. Perhaps the very first and greatest resistance in history was that of the Hurrians against the forces of this original central civilization. This process of resistance can be seen in the Sumerian tablets. Even the Epic of Gilgamesh clearly explains how this first expedition targeted the northern forests. Contemporary Iraq, Uruk, still a boiling cauldron, dramatically mirrors the continuation of this reality and tradition. The conflict between the Kurds with Hurrian roots and the Arabs with Semitic roots arguably still bears these ancient characteristics. The only thing that has changed is the nature of the center and the periphery, who holds hegemonic power, and the different technologies available. The Hurrians are the original tribes of the Fertile Crescent. They could resist and develop their own civilization because they had been profoundly influenced by the agricultural revolution. Numerous archaeological discoveries provide insight into the establishment of the first Hurrian urban centers around 3000 BCE, independent of any Sumerian center. The megaliths found near the city of Urfa, Göbekli Tepe, 10,000 to 8,000 BCE, which predate the Neolithic Revolution, are particularly important evidence of this region's civilizational roots, which have had ongoing repercussions in the world of science. I think that the Sumerians were colonies with Hurrian roots that first settled in Lower Mesopotamia. Thus, it is understandable that both the Hittites and the Mitannis, with their Hurrian roots, established empires in central Anatolia and the southeast of present-day Turkey after 1600 BCE. Other civilizations may also have developed in these areas. Analysis of Göbekli Tepe ruins might provide us with a different view of civilization. The expansion of the Sumerians via the sea, the Persian Gulf, led to civilization colonies in what are today Oman, Yemen, and even Abyssinia, Ethiopia. A city as big as Harappa has been discovered in Oman. The Babylonians and Assyrians developed a second method for overcoming the crisis. The Babylonians developed industry and science, while the Assyrians established a trade monopoly in a continuous effort to expand Sumerian civilization, while simultaneously attempting to resolve the serious problems it faced. In terms of science and industry, Babel was the true London, Paris, Amsterdam, and Venice of its time. In fact, during its ascension, it was even more famous than today's New York. It was no accident that Alexander drew his last breath in a waning Babel. It could even be argued that Saddam was the last tragic victim of the love for Babel, alongside thousands of others who cannot be enumerated here. When I tried to unravel Assyria's trade monopoly, the trade monopolies of Venice, Netherlands, and England spring to mind. The Assyrian trade monopoly, along with the Phoenician monopoly, was perhaps the most enterprising and creative in history. It is undisputed that the Assyrians developed trading networks, the famous karums, places of profit, karhaneler, from Central Asia, even it is claimed reaching China, to Western Anatolia, from Arabia to the shores of the Black Sea. There is no question that they founded the first major trading empire. This trading octopus can be divided into 3 periods, from 2000 BCE to 1600 BCE, from 1600 BCE to 1300 BCE, and finally, from 1300 BCE until 600 BCE. In this sense, it is unparalleled. Nonetheless, apart from a limited capacity to expand and strengthen the central Sumerian civilization, trade offers little else of analytical value for an overall solution of problems. Moreover, the trade monopoly has always been a collaborator of the main monopoly, the priest and the soldier and the ruler. Disagreements among them never goes beyond struggles of higher profit shares. Yet the fact that Assyria was a vehicle for the Sumerian central civilization for 1500 years should not be underestimated. It is one of the strongest links in the chain of civilization. Harappa, Oman, Hittite, Mitanni, and Egypt easily fell into internal decay because they were unable to achieve a similar success. It is undeniable that the most decisive role in the uninterrupted reign of central civilization was played by the Phoenicians, the Medes, Persians, and the late Hittites, as well as the Assyrians who influenced Greek civilization through trading contact. The trade monopoly did not solve the existing problems, but by spreading products that aid development, including ideas and beliefs, everywhere, it facilitated the ongoing growth and survival of the civilization for a while longer. Otherwise, it would have inevitably shared the fate of Harappa. History may have repeated itself for several thousand years, but let's not forget that the trade monopoly is the cruelest form of capital accumulation monopoly, whose political representatives never hesitated to engage in the most brutal of practices, for example, castles and ramparts built from human skulls. Moreover, it is well known that trade monopolies use price differences and differences in the production costs of goods to attain significant profit with minimal labor. Here we are not talking about small commodity exchanges or trade for non-profit purposes or consumption. We are talking about monopolistic, profit-driven trade. It is very likely that Harappa collapsed because it was unable to expand outward and develop trade. The new kingdom of Egypt, from 1600 to 1000 BCE, which failed to develop the skills necessary to establish a trade monopoly and open up to the outside world, withered away under the dual impact of internal struggles and external attacks. Our world might have been different had the new kingdom of Egypt expanded as much as Sumer. China, on the other hand, did not see the need to overflow its borders, perhaps because it was already large enough. Clearly, the boom of the first central civilization reached another stage by spreading the grave problems it caused across the world. There are intellectuals who postulate that for the first time in history, the Anatolian, Mesopotamian, and Egyptian civilizations acquired a central and hegemonic character primarily by becoming intertwined between 1600 and 1200 BCE. Although it is not called a golden age, it is clear that there was a great leap in urbanization, trade, and the development of an aristocracy. Evidently, the spread of the problems has contributed to the frequent shift in the location of the central hegemony and prolonged the life of the system. The famous Treaty of Kadesh, an Egyptian-Hittite peace treaty concluded around 1280 BCE, reflects the reality of this period. The crisis of the central civilization from 1200 to 800 BCE eased as ironworking techniques superseded bronze technology from 3000 to 1000 BCE. While the developments in production and war techniques always contribute to any era's uniqueness, social development is undoubtedly the decisive factor. But this social development is closely linked to technology. The hegemonic center moved outside Mesopotamia for the first time, taking the initial steps in the shift to the west and toward Europe. In this shift, the Median Persian Empire, 600 to 330 BCE, by land, and the Phoenicians, 1200 to 330 BCE, by sea, would constitute the transitional phase. The Urartu, 850 to 600 BCE, would later play a similar role. Social crises, although not completely overcome, was alleviated by iron technology and widespread secure trade routes sustaining civilization. The Median Persian Empire initiated important trade offensives via the land and the Phoenicians via the Mediterranean Sea. The Greeks were a colony of these two civilizations for a long time. Western-centric history considers the Greek-Ionian civilization to be original, but more realistic research shows that this civilization acquired most of its features from the expansion of these two civilizations. When we add Egyptian, Babylonian, and Cretan influence to the Median Persian and Phoenician influences, then it becomes undeniable that the famous Greek civilization is largely an imported product. No doubt, the Greek-Ionian synthesis cannot be underestimated, but it is clearly not original. In fact, none of the civilizations are original. They are all based on gathering Neolithic societies' values, either by extortion or through trade monopoly, and often both. Alterations of these values may have led to new syntheses, but as Gordon Childe points out, only developments in Europe from the 16th century onward are comparable to Neolithic societies' technological innovations in the Taurus and Zagros arc in 16,000 to 4,000 BCE. The construction of the central civilization began around this technology, with the rise of the city of Uruk from 4000 BCE onward. The most fundamental factor in the conflict between the goddess Inanna and the god Enki is the mess, the Neolithic technology organized around women, with me meaning technical invention, that Enki stole from Inanna. Here the relationship between male supremacy, which develops parallel to civilization, and the control of technology is emphasized. This example alone indicates the great educational value of Sumerian mythology. Of course, the language of those days isn't that of today. It was charged with mythology. The Greek-Ionian civilization from 600 to 300 BCE, rising on both shores of the Aegean, was undoubtedly an important link in the historical chain. It marked a great breakthrough in social development, making significant contributions both in terms of the mindset and in technical and practical areas. It also greatly improved upon the legacy of the Phoenicians in maritime transportation. It formed colonies all along the shores of Europe. By developing the technique of writing, again influenced by the Phoenician legacy, Greek-Ionian civilization made an important contribution to today's alphabet. In fact, it was responsible for revolutionary developments in all of the known sciences of the day, as well as a total revolution in philosophy. It put an end to the era of Sumerian gods with Olympian gods, while the works of Homer carried the tradition of the Gilgamesh epic to its peak. There were similar revolutionary developments in theater, music, and architecture, with magnificent cities built. Building techniques for temples, palaces, theaters, stadiums, and assembly halls from that period continue to reverberate today, and neither the leap forward in production and trade nor the progress in industry should be downplayed. Historic examples of democracy were introduced in the political realm that proved the superiority of democracy over other forms of governance, even if within the framework of civilization. All of the above does not, however, change the fact that Greek-Ionian civilization is a link in the central civilization system that began with the Sumerians. It confirms it. When we consider the role that Greek civilization played in solving the social problem, or better, its part in the development of the problem, it becomes clear that there is no essential difference between this civilization and the ones that preceded it. All progress made, in particular, by Athenian democracy, indicates that the problem of central civilization were aggravated, not solved. A few examples to follow. Women's captivity deepened. They were not only obliged to produce children and serve men at home, like the lowest of slaves, they were also banned from participating in politics, sports, science, or administration. They were obliged to do all the difficult production work. Plato was of the opinion that living with a woman demeaned a man's nobility, one of the reasons for the widespread homosexual relationships at that time. Slavery in general, not only women's, also expanded immensely during this period. For the first time, there was a large number of unemployed slaves. This was also when the military institution of mercenaries first arose. Not only goods, but also slaves were widely exported. In contrast, the most parasitic class of masters sprung up, and the concept of an aristocracy came into being. The social sphere was overrun with parasitic elements. The segments of society closest to the bourgeois class were the product of the Greek civilization. In short, new problems were added to the already existing problems, and existing problems were aggravated. Urban development attained magnificence, and the city an organic structure. But these developments were achieved at the expense of further aggravating the social problem. It is almost as if the structures of ziggurats and pyramids were pulled to pieces, only to be replicated in much greater dimension. The first phase of the city was the temple and its appendages. The second phase was the construction of the citadel and the surrounding inner and outer ramparts in its foothills. And in the third phase, these divisions were removed, and with new additions, the city attained the spatial richness and splendor. All of this ran parallel to the growth of monopoly. These developments didn't solve the problems, but once again amplified them. The army of slaves exploded, and the number of unemployed slaves grew for the first time, as people found themselves redundant. This is as severe as a social problem can get. The system that produces unemployment is the cruelest of systems. A similar growth can be observed in power and the state apparatuses. Power spread to occupy not only the upper floors of society, but the lower floors as well. The state domination of the society grew as it gained a stranglehold on the political sphere. A state bureaucracy was formed, and the military class reinforced its privilege. In general, a rise in power over women, children, and youth, slaves, peasants, and craftspeople was palpable in the social fabric. The worst thing about Athenian democracy was the way the state blatantly hollowed out politics. The communal democratic tradition seemed to have drawn its last breath with the help of the Athenian aristocracy, and this is surely the most important lesson to be learned from the Athenian democracy. The monopoly of Roman civilization, from 750 BCE to 500 CE, is a continuation of the Greek Ionian tradition and should be evaluated within that framework. It is an example of the transfer of civilization from one peninsula to another. The most important thing to be said at this point is that if the Greeks were this civilization's period of childhood and youth, Rome was its maturity and old age. What had been taken from the East was assimilated and synthesized by Rome in a way that gave this civilization an edge over the East for the first time. Another of Rome's successes was integrating parts of Europe into civilization through brutal occupation and colonization. In all other ways, Rome was little more than an overgrowth of the Greek touchstone. Nonetheless, class and power evolved to a fantastic degree in the city, and the kingdom was transformed into an aristocratic republic, laying the base for the most powerful and extensive empire in history. As the Roman way of life became fashionable everywhere, the Roman aristocracy, like the bourgeois of today's modernity, was the decisive power of the modernity of the time. Parasitic aristocracy and a lumpen proletariat were stark reminders of Rome's raging problems. It can be said that the social problem reached its peak during the Roman period. Little wonder. There is a direct link between the cumulative growth of the central civilization's monopoly and the growth of the inherent problem caused by it. Despite the terrible punishments, crucifixions, being torn apart by lions, cities, including Carthage, razed, the internal conquest of society by Christianity, the political party of the poor, and the flow of the barbarian clans from the outside into Rome meant an explosion of problems. In essence, an outburst of the spirit of freedom. It is clear that the true barbarian was Rome, and that its collapse was caused by the enormous and ever-growing internal and external social problems. The collapse of Rome marked not only the end of the Roman city, Roman power, and the Roman aristocracy, but the decline of the civilization that had its roots in the emergence of the city of Uruk, with its characteristic structure of center-periphery, competition-hegemony, and rise-fall. Indeed, it was the collapse of the world system itself. Thus, the most savage period in history came to a close as a result of the problems caused by this anti-society system and the internal and external resistance that developed against it.